Well, Keith, first of all, thanks for having me, and thanks to Respiratory Associates for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all tonight. Today, we'll be talking about the respiratory effects of vaping. So, specifically focusing on the youth, the young people at risk populations, and then the effects of vaping on the lungs. This is still relatively new ground. So, vaping has been available, or e-cigarettes have been available in the United States since about 2007. So we're only looking at about 15 years of history here. And so I think that one of the take-home messages is that the effects are really still relatively unknown, and there's still more research to do. But with that, we'll go ahead and get started, and that's kind of a roadmap of where we will be for the rest of the evening here. So a little bit of background about myself. I am a respiratory therapist and the director of clinical services at Movare. We're an Austin-based medical device company working in the home ventilation space. I started my career at UPMC in Pittsburgh. I spent about 10 years in adult critical care in the cardiac and neurological ICUs. Worked in the DME industry in home care as an RT for several years, and then was recruited to come to Movare upon the launch of the Louisa ventilator in the US. And so really kind of led the product launch and the clinical team there. Outside of work, I pretty much do anything to get your pulse pounding. So skydiving, off-road driving, zip lining, and I tell people, listen, I'll do anything one time. So if you have anything that you want to do and nobody else will do it with you, reach out to me and we'll make it happen. I currently live with my wife and 3 kids outside of Pittsburgh, and I've been here pretty much my whole life. So again, appreciate you taking some time with me tonight, and looking forward to this. The goals tonight are pretty simple. I want to look at some of the recent history surrounding e-cigarette usage and vaping in the United States, and kind of look at the origin of the modern e-cigarette. Understand some of the unique challenges when we look at regulation and some of the products that are available. Evaluate and understand the effects of vaping on the respiratory system for our patients, and identify some of the different products available that make vaping and e-cigarette usage more discreet and target certain audiences. And so there's definitely a wide variety of products, as we'll get into in just a few minutes. And discretion is certainly one of the key features of a lot of them. So with that, we'll dig into it a little bit. So the use of e-cigarettes has grown really over the last 2 decades. Again, it started in about 2007 here in the States. And while devices may be useful to help traditional smokers quit, the concerns are definitely persistent around vaping in the young adult and adolescent population. So that's going to be the constant push and pull as we go through this presentation tonight, really looking at how we can't necessarily limit the devices for folks that are using them for appropriate purposes, but we do need to be very careful and very cognizant of those devices overall and the market overall and its effect on our young people. Like cigarettes generations ago, there are powerful marketing campaigns, and we'll get into that in just a little bit as well. And a lot of the devices look like common household or office items, allowing people to kind of participate on the down low. And these are definitely unique challenges, especially as it relates to the younger population. The market in the U.S. really has just exploded since it was introduced here in 2007. In 2014, e-cigarettes accounted for about $2.5 billion in revenue. And by 2028, that number is expected to hit $10 billion. So a 400% increase in anticipated growth from 2014 to 2028. And actually, estimates by the end of the decade are that e-cigarettes will actually outpace traditional tobacco products by the end of the 2020s. So it's a huge industry and something that I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on. The modern e-cigarette was really born in 2003, and by 2007, again, they were available here in the United States, with 2006 kind of introduced to the European market. It was introduced by a Chinese pharmacist by the name of Han Lick. He created the commercially marketable smokeless device after his dad, who was a longtime smoker, died from complications of lung cancer. And Han actually had a pretty nasty smoking habit himself, of a couple packs a day. And so his hope at the time was that it would help him to curb his own addiction and also help others who had struggled with smoking addiction and nicotine addiction over the course of the years. So many advocates do see e-cigarette usage as a safer alternative to traditional cigarettes, and would argue that e-cigarette vapor is less harmful than traditional cigarette smoke. And that was Han's mindset and rationale as well. But because the focus of e-cigarettes as an has been really as an alternative to combustible cigarettes, we don't really have a great idea of how many folks have actually successfully stopped smoking altogether using them as a quitting aid, right? So the evidence is that it's just unclear, right? How many people have totally stopped smoking as a result of e-cigarette usage. In the 2017 update to the PATH study, results showed that only 2.2% of smokers actually successfully moved from combustible cigarettes to e-cigarettes, and that those smokers that did make that switch were more likely to go back to traditional cigarettes than those who had successfully used other pharmacological quitting aids or nicotine replacement therapies. And so it is important to note that the FDA and the CDC don't recommend e-cigarettes as a smoking cessation aid, and they would say that your nicotine lozenges, gum, and patches could be used, but e-cigarettes aren't necessarily useful in the eyes of those particular agencies. And again, because total smoking cessation isn't an endpoint of any of the studies out there, it's really hard to make an inference of whether or not people have successfully, or at least in mass, have successfully quit smoking with the help of e-cigarettes, or if they've just transitioned from one device to another and continued on with their nicotine habit. So the timeline looks basically like this. In the 30s and again in the 60s, there were patents issued for devices that were never commercialized. And then at the end of the 1970s, Phil Ray from the Philip Morris Company actually produced an electronic cigarette system, but it wasn't very successful commercially. And then you have a 30-year or so gap before the e-cigarette that we know today was produced and then eventually introduced to the U.S. market. As an aside, we said that Han Lick was hopeful to stop his own smoking habit with the use of e-cigarettes. He was also unsuccessful. So an interview 2 years ago, he actually not only has been unsuccessful in quitting traditional cigarettes, but has added on additionally e-cigarette usage as well. So he's what is known as a dual user, and is actually probably among the most high-risk patients when we get into smoking and kind of looking at the risks associated. He's using both combustible and electronic cigarettes, so maybe didn't have the intended effect that he wanted personally, at least. And so breaking down the delivery method of an e-cigarette, what you're really looking at is a battery-powered device that is going to heat a nicotine cartridge plus or minus flavorings. It's going to heat the nicotine cartridge with a heating coil and basically superheat that so that it is able to be aerosolized, breathed into the lungs, and then breathed out as a vapor. So you have your LED at the end, at the other end, your battery, which is a lithium-ion battery, voltage controller, heating coil, vaporizing changer, and then the atomizer and the actual cartridge itself. And we'll see in a few minutes that cartridge has grown over the years and certainly is increasing in size in a lot of the disposable products on the market. But that's the basic diagram. And because the batteries are lithium ion, there's certain risks associated with the batteries as well. But folks have also found ways to modify those batteries to make some of the contents of the e-cigarettes more potent. And so there's all kinds of different variations, but this is the basic anatomy of an electronic cigarette. And then when we look at what's inside, no surprise that e-cigarettes could pose health risks, and that there's a bunch of chemicals that are emitted from the e-cigarettes in addition to the nicotine, right? So we have moderate evidence in a National Academies of Science report that youth who use e-cigarettes are at an increased risk for cough, wheezing, and asthma attacks, which should not come as a surprise to any of you. And some e-cigarettes have been proven to contain herbicides, formaldehyde, and vegetable glycerin. So there's a lot of different chemicals and a lot of different components and a lot of different carriers in these devices that are just not quite understood fully. And that's the best way that I know to say it. It's an evolving industry, and certainly we're learning more about it as time goes on as well. We know that traditional cigarettes contain about 7,000 chemicals, and that e-cigarettes contain, well, all you can find is in the literature is that they contain less. We don't necessarily know how much less. We don't know all of the compounds that are available in all of the products, and it comes down to the fact that regulation has lagged behind production, and it's a largely still kind of unregulated industry, at least in the online world of distributors and manufacturers. So there are definite concerns and definitely a lot more to learn about the composition of certain e-cigarettes. What's not up for debate is the prevalence of e-cigarette usage. So from January 2020 to December of 2022, there was a 46.6% increase in sales per month of e-cigarettes, and those are the disposables and the refillables. So, we've kind of accounted for both there. And according to a recent study, there are over 9,000 device and flavor combinations of e-cigarettes in the market. So just kind of let that sink in for a minute. Just when you think you're kind of getting around one of them and understanding, something, there's 8,999 other variants out there, and they differ again in composition, in capacities, in nicotine concentrations, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole lot of variation, and certainly it presents a big challenge when you're looking at kind of normalizing the market and maybe regulating some of the devices that are out there. Now, the disposables have really taken off over the last several years, and they make up over half of the market. So initially, kind of prior to any attempts at regulation, the disposables made up about 24% of the market, and now they make up over half. And the reason is flavorings, and we'll get into that in just a second. But again, some estimates are going to say that e-cigarettes are going to outpace traditional cigarette sales by the end of the decade. And, we're looking at the kind of the front end of that, I think, as these numbers will show you that we continue to ramp up usage of e-cigarettes and kind of the devices available continue to proliferate as well. So the FDA attempted to regulate e-cigarettes in 2019, and one of the hallmarks of that legislation was that they were going to ban flavored e-cigarettes, but they were only banning flavored cartridges that were used to refill e-cigarettes. Right? They weren't banning any disposables, and at the time, the disposable market, like I said, made up about a quarter of the total market. Now, flavored disposables make up about 51% of the total market. So it's just an example of the industry and the manufacturers and producers being a little bit more agile than the FDA and the regulators, right? So the industry can respond a little bit faster and kind of look for and exploit loopholes. And I think that's what you're seeing here with this market share of the total market. What else has happened in addition to that is these disposable e-cigarettes, as opposed to the refillables, is that capacities of the e-liquid have grown significantly. So these newer products have about 5 times the capacity of e-liquid and about triple the amount of nicotine as their predecessors. So we have a very large capacity and very potent deliverable here of being breathed into the patient's lungs, and certainly the industry continues to evolve and become more and more concentrated, and and higher total concentrations as well. And so what's happened as well is that the price of these products, the disposable products, have decreased significantly. So you have a threefold increase in the amount of nicotine and a threefold decrease in the actual price per milliliter of liquid. And so we have a very potent device that is probably more accessible now than it's ever been. And, those are significant concerns when we look at the industry and what we can do as RTs and what we need to be aware of to kind of help, help patients that are either using e-cigarettes or that have been exposed to them, and how we can kind of stand in the gap. So these are significant changes in the composition of the product and the price of the product, which makes it more accessible to just about everybody across the board. And so we said in December 2019 there were two key pieces of legislation. The one was the banning of the flavored e-cigarettes, and the other was to increase the age of purchase from tobacco products from 18 to 21 years of age. And so there was certainly well-intentioned policies, I'm sure, but the blind spots and unforeseen side effects was that disposable market has really boomed and has potentially introduced products that are even more dangerous than what was on the market prior to, right? So a lot of times regulation, even if it's well-intentioned, doesn't get it all the way right, and then you have some unintended consequences as well. So among the other challenges here is just the ability to balance effective regulation with unintended effects. Again, we're looking at a portion of the population, certainly the adult population, that has used e-cigarettes as a quitting aid, and an outright ban or something of that nature would be detrimental to those patients and those folks that are trying to quit. But continuing on like we are poses a significant risk to the young people in our nation as well. And so it really is kind of a push and pull, and there's a lot of thought and a lot of nuance that goes into it. But again, if you look at the different flavors that are available and the different devices that are available, many young people have been shown to be willing to try e-cigarettes. And initially the thought was, well, a lot of young people are trying cigarettes as well, right? But even in previous non-smokers, we're seeing an uptick in young people trying e-cigarettes that didn't necessarily smoke ahead of time, right? According to the recent CDC report, among e-cigarette users aged 18 to 24, 16.3% were current smokers, 22.3% were former smokers, and over 61% had never been cigarette smokers. And so that points to the other kind of delicate side of the issue, where we do have these products that are available to help people stop smoking, but are we really doing that effectively, or are we causing more folks to be exposed to nicotine and to tobacco smoke down the line, and that wouldn't necessarily have been smokers of any form otherwise? So it is definitely a challenging area, and certainly something that we have to continue to work on. So looking at the prevalence among young adults, this graph here shows from 2011 to 2018 in school-age children. Certainly a significant across-the-board increase. And again, you look at these devices, and we will look at a few of them in just a couple minutes. You're looking at bright colors, you're looking at attractive packaging, kind of familiar characters, and devices that allow you to be discreet and to not be recognized for what you're doing. And so from 2011 to 2018, you've seen about a 20% increase. So 20% of school-age girls and about almost 25%, or 1 in 4 school-age male students, have either tried e-cigarettes or have used them within the last 30 days, according to the data here. So a really significant portion of our youth, and that those numbers are obviously higher in high school students and lower in middle school students. I don't have it broken down here, but high school students, there was a statistic just recently that said that over 75% of high school seniors had tried an e-cigarette at some point, in their lives. And so when you look at developing tissue, brain tissue, lung tissue, and really, it's very important in adolescence, especially, that we monitor this and try to find ways to curb this trend, because it's definitely trending in the wrong direction. And so what do some of the advertising campaigns look like? I think as we go through the next few slides, you'll see a pretty familiar story as you look back and kind of think about, what early tobacco advertising looked like, and what the tobacco industry really did to convince people that not only were their products safe, but they were socially acceptable and even preferable, right? And so you're going to see a lot of the same trends, I think, play out, and we have seen a lot of the same trends play out in the e-cigarette and electronic world as we have with traditional combustible tobacco products. But one thing that was really concerning, just this year, in August, the FDA issued a warning letter to distributors of 15 different online retailers that were marketing products determined to be a shamelessly egregious attempt to target kids. And I don't really know that there's another way to interpret what you're looking at. You see e-cigarettes in the shape of cartoon characters, e-cigarettes in the shape of coffee drinks, even e-cigarettes shaped like, I don't know. Mario's never been purple, but that's I think they're trying. So there's a lot of different devices out there that are specifically targeting children, and there's not really another way to interpret this in my mind. And these are just some of the examples of the devices that were shown in the FDA's report. Uh, so we're no longer looking at simply a quitting aid, but we're looking at kind of how we can get the next generation of smokers on board in some of these online retailers. And again, it's just tough to fully regulate. And I guess that's the take home message, is that there are all kinds of products out there that just haven't been able to be fully vetted and that are targeting probably one of the most vulnerable populations in our country. So we said that, most of the current marketing has its roots in early advertising for other tobacco products. And certainly the marketing's become more direct. And what I thought was interesting is, even though it's commonly accepted as a potential quitting aid, much of the marketing suggests not quitting at all and just being more discreet, right? So you'll see typically there's going to be use of celebrity, use of medical personnel, medical jargon, and kind of, really trying to drive home the illusion of credibility and safety in these products. And so just pulled up a few of my favorites. These are the vintage kind of nicotine ads. So going back to combustible cigarettes back in probably the 40s, 50s, and 60s. These are some of the best. This is Dr. Betty's asthma cigarettes for your health. So I found this to be really interesting. Effectively treats asthma, hay fever, foul breath, all diseases of the throat, head colds, canker sores, and bronchial irritations. Unfortunately, though, for those of you on the call here, it's not recommended for children under the age of 6. So you're going to have to find something else for those folks. Whiskey on the gums, very helpful for a lot of those kids. Great news for me. My youngest just turned 6 on the 7th of the month. So we are now a full family of 5 smoking Dr. Batty's asthma cigarettes at nighttime, right before bed. It's a great routine. Seem to be working pretty well. You can smoke a fresh cigarette with Camels, so giving your throat a vacation, which who doesn't like a vacation? The doctor there looks to be pretty happy with his choice. Your dentist, Visceroys is kind of, it's what your dentist smokes. How bad could that be? So filter the smoke and be happy to do it. And then you have our health cigar, which is one of my all-time favorites. Mellowell cigars are interested in regaining or people interested in regaining or keeping physical fitness. So for any of you out there that, the holidays are coming and you're going to be eating a lot of good food, and then, you want to get back into physical shape, try the health cigar and let me know, how that works. They're filtered and should be great for you. So those are kind of the vintage, the nicotine ads. And then if we look at kind of the e-cigarette ads, you're going to see a lot of the same components, right? So you have some celebrity that, who's that? Jenny McCarthy, focusing on the freedom of a cigarette without the guilt, the taste and feel that's better than a real cigarette. You exhale only, pleasant vapor, and a boatload of chemicals, but it didn't make the ad. And then why quit? Switch to blue. So this is really interesting to me, this one here, because, originally these were marketed as quitting aids, right? As something to help folks with smoking cessation. And this the ad here says, nobody likes a quitter, so make the switch to blue. And then lastly, for RTs, this one's fantastic. Love your lungs and try our vape, right? So this is the one for the RTs in the crowd. This is the best for you. So the advertising is very much the same as it's always been. It's not a new tack, but it is certainly very potent advertising. And then some of the devices available. This is a hoodie manufactured specifically for e-cigarette use. So if you're on the slopes and you want hit the slopes and hit the vape at the same time, you have the option there. You've got highlighters, you've got all kinds of office products. And so I guess the take home message here is that, these are designed to mimic everyday items, right? And so when you think about the young adults, when you think about people in the office environment, whatever the case may be, the goal here with USB sticks and highlighters and your hoodie strings and credit cards and so on and so forth is that these are designed to be discreet and to allow you um, and to allow folks to take them inside buildings and kind of wherever they are, right? And so not all of these products are bad, but or are detrimental, but it's certainly worth noting that a lot of these are geared towards the young adult population. And so really the last part of this is, how does e-cigarette use affect the lungs? What are we looking at from a respiratory standpoint? And so it breaks down like this. You have your e-cigarette, and then kind of breaking it out, you have your liquid, and then you have the battery. And we've talked about a little bit about the battery and about the dangers of lithium-ion batteries in general. There have been battery explosions with facial burns and scarring. And then obviously if those batteries are modified, which we've talked about as well, that creates a more potent mixture that's being inhaled. And so the rest of these effects are kind of amplified in that particular case. So if you look at the e-liquid and break it down kind of from bottom to top, you have your nicotine, which we did look at, and certainly with the disposables has become more and more potent. So you have not only the danger of nicotine toxicity, but also the addictive properties of nicotine. And then inside the vapor, you have a host of other chemicals that have been identified. And like I said, there's also a lot that have not yet been identified. So starting at the top, you have acetopropanol, which is possibly causative of popcorn lung, which we'll get to in a minute. And then you have formaldehyde. Pretty much any aldehydes you see, you don't want to breathe in. You're not really that interested in typical everyday life. Formaldehyde is a preservative. It's also a known carcinogen, so you have the risk of cancers there. Ultrafine particles, nickel and chromium are heavy metals, so you have toxic particles there, and that's going to be detrimental to cognitive functioning and to brain development in pregnancy. And then you have the glycerol and the glycol, which are most commonly known as components in commercial fog machines. So if you think of a concert or I don't know, a sports event, right, where they're running out through the fog, that is glycerol and glycol, and it's used the same way in e-cigarettes. It's used to create the vapor. It is a carrier, but it's also an upper respiratory tract irritant. And as a general rule, if the carriers of your liquid are detrimental to your lung tissue, then the rest of the liquid probably isn't the greatest either. So we've talked about the dependence on nicotine. There's no surprise that with a nicotine delivering device, the dependence is going to be there. But glycerin and glycol, which we just talked about, is what causes kind of the cloud or the vapor. And studies have also shown that they're toxic to small airway cells, problematic for patients with COPD, decreased cell proliferation, and increased cell death, right? So not the greatest for our lung tissues. And again, this is the carrier of the rest of the, the contents. So again, not necessarily saying that this isn't safer than a traditional cigarette, because it probably is, but it's not without its own set of side effects and potential risks. And I guess that's the take-home message. Delicate lung tissue, well, let's be honest, anything that you're inhaling into your lungs is problematic for the lung tissue. And then you have small airway irritation, bronchoconstriction, and exacerbation of underlying lung disease. So obviously patients that are dealing, or people that are dealing with COPD and chronic respiratory disease, should steer clear of putting anything into their body, regardless of whether that be an e-cigarette, a traditional cigarette, or something else. And we said before that it was also indicative of increased asthma attacks in patients, in youth that have asthma. And so again, just be very cognizant of the fact that, it is maybe a safer alternative, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a safe alternative all the time. So a couple things here. We're going to look at kind of a couple of the acute effects of e-cigarettes, or the potential acute effects of e-cigarettes. One being popcorn lung, and then we're going to look at EVALI, which we'll get to in the next slide. But again, with all the combinations of flavors and combinations of devices available, many of the sweet flavors are created with saccharides. So these are like the cotton candy and the blue raspberry and all those fun flavors. They're going to degrade and produce aldehydes, which again, we were trying to avoid. So diacetyl and acetopropanol, those are chemicals that are used by food manufacturers typically to add flavors like butter, caramel, butterscotch, fruit flavoring. And they're also prevalent in up to 90% of flavored e-cigarette liquid, right? So these are things that are safe in consumption. When you're consuming food that's been flavored with them, they're considered safe. When you're breathing them into your lungs, that's a whole nother ball of wax. And these chemicals have been linked to bronchiolitis obliterans, or obliterative bronchitis, in factory workers. So this comes from a early 2000s study of 8 workers at a microwave popcorn plant in Missouri. So they were recognized to have recurrent pulmonary symptoms. These were folks that were previously healthy. And when researchers dug into the possible causes, they found out that they were in the flavoring room where these flavorings were being applied and being heated to the microwave popcorn. And so they isolated acetopropanol as the probable cause. 4 of the 8 patients then continued. So some of them quit their jobs, some of them stayed. They got progressively worse and were listed for lung transplant. And obliterative bronchitis was what they were diagnosed with, all 8 of them. And it's a type of obstructive lung disease. It's, in this case, an occupational exposure, fibrotic changes in the airways, and spirometry showing an obstructive pattern. So you have a restrictive and obstructive disease, so a mixed airway disease, progressive decline in lung function, and an incurable situation that requires lifelong management. So that was, again, early 2000s in Missouri. They performed CTs on the lungs of these patients, and they were all shown to have bronchial wall thickening, air trapping, and actually 5 of the 8 were shown to have bronchiectasis as well. And so bronchiectasis, of course, is the destruction of small airways, the dilation of those airways, and then the pooling of sputum in the pockets there. A lot of times bronchiectasis is going to lead to increased infection risk, and then that's going to create inflammation, which kind of perpetuates that cycle all over again, right? So bronchiectasis is already prevalent in COPD patients, and an overlap of about anywhere from 30 to 50%, depending on kind of where you're reading that information. And so, at-risk patients, certainly a concern for them. But again, bronchiectasis was found in 5 of 8. And then a New England Journal of Medicine investigative article identified irreversible fibrotic airway disease, bronchial wall thickening, mucus hypersecretion and pooling, and high-resolution CT changes consistent with bronchiolitis obliterans in 4 e-cigarette users in 2022. And so we can't necessarily say that one is causative of the other, but we can say that the chemicals found in e-cigarettes are the same as the chemicals that were found to cause obliterative bronchitis in patients earlier on, right? And so again, it's not a causative link, but it is something to be aware of, especially as we look at, the young folks and our adolescents and school-age children and patients that are at risk already. There's no use in working with something that's going to compound the problem if we can avoid it. And then EVALI, this was really an epidemic, in late 2019. And I don't know how many of you may have dealt with patients that were dealing with this problem. But in 2019, about 2,800 cases of EVALI, or e-cigarette and vaping associated lung injury, were reported in U.S. patients. many of which were young adults. So EVOLI was responsible for 68 deaths as well. And the causative factor for these particular patients was vitamin E acetate and THC. But I think it really highlights the danger that's kind of often overlooked, right? So significantly, again, we're dealing with a largely, we'll say it this way, we're dealing with a relatively new industry with relatively unknown manufacturers who are making products daily and weekly that people are breathing into their lungs, and we just can't solve for all of the variables. So especially when you look at the online marketplace and aftermarket kind of devices that are out there, we just can't be sure what's in a lot of the disposables, and I think that's the cause for concern mostly, is that this is an underregulated industry, and there's certainly dangers posed by some of the substances that can be breathed in. And so in this case, like I said, 68 folks ended up dying, and 2,800 cases were reported, and some of these people had lifelong effects from these lung injuries. And so the PFTs post-hospitalization in these folks didn't always indicate irreversible airway disease, but it does underscore, again, the danger posed by breathing in things that we're not entirely sure of. And then maybe lastly, when you look at chronic lung disease and the chronic conditions that can be perpetuated by this as well, the likelihood of developing chronic lung disease is significantly increased with any type of cigarette usage, whether that be traditional or e-cigarettes. And a recent study that was published in 2020, I think the information was from the end of 2017, in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, shows that participants who did smoke e-cigarettes were at a 75% greater risk of developing chronic lung disease than those who don't smoke or vape. And of course, in this particular study, findings in this study would also suggest that dual users or users of both combustible and e-cigarettes, like our good friend Han Lick, who invented all of this in the first place, have higher risk of recurrent pulmonary and cardiac complications. And so really, I guess the take-home message is, again, we don't know what we don't know. And as research continues to come out regarding e-cigarette usage and comparing them to traditional cigarettes, or looking at them as a standalone entity and what may or may not be involved in them, there's a lot of unknowns and a lot of variables that have yet to be solved for in these situations. And certainly when we look at our patients that we deal with on a daily and weekly basis, it's something to keep in mind that e-cigarette usage could potentially be significant and possibly as bad as combustible cigarettes in some cases, certainly with patients who have underlying lung disease already, or patients with a history of lung problems that maybe are not acutely exacerbated. But it can certainly cause a cause for concern in our respiratory patients. And I think as research continues, hopefully we'll learn a lot more, and regulation will continue to catch up to the production of some of these devices, and we can find a way to hopefully make the industry a bit more standard and the products a bit more standard as well. So although generally considered safer than combustible cigarettes, e-cigarettes still do pose significant health risks, and health risks that are not yet fully understood, especially in young adult populations. And while they are potentially useful for weaning patients from combustible cigarettes or smoking cessation, many young people who have never smoked are current e-cigarette users. And so again, it's that push and pull of kind of, finding the balance there of helping the folks that need help and are using this as an aid for that help, and also preventing young people and at-risk populations from doing harm to themselves, certainly in their developmental years, and also in patients that have already had lung problems. Although regulation is catching up with the market in some regards, there are still a lot of gaps, as evidenced by the flavoring ban and the disposables. And research is ongoing to evaluate long-term effects of e-cigarette usage. But current research is enough to raise significant concern that it's not necessarily a safe alternative, although it may be a safer alternative.